So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the WinPE Masterclass series with Trilegal. In this series, we are aiming to bring some knowledge sessions to our constituents. We had the first session 2 weeks back on August 7th, which was focused on term sheets. This is our second session where we'll talk about the changing practices and the changing face of due diligence in the wake of the pandemic. We'll have the last session for the current series 2 weeks later on September 4th, which will talk about M&A. For today, we have Upasana and Kunal from Trilegal. They're both experts in their respective fields, and I will request them to introduce themselves as I hand over to them. And we are joined by Puncham Mukim from Everstone to provide us with the practical on-ground aspects and all the insights that he has gained in the last 1.5 years working on both new deals as well as exits. I can't imagine a better set of people to hand all of you over to, bringing really the expert, practitioner, advisor, investor insights and learning in a very hands-on, practical manner. So over to you, Upasana, Kunal, and Puncham, and thank you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. You can share your questions in the chat box. We will be sharing the questions with the presenters, and they will try and weave in the questions during the session, and whatever questions are left, we will try and address them at the end. So welcome once again, and over to you, Upasana and Kunal.
Thank you, Nupur. Thanks a lot. So just to introduce myself very quickly, I'm Upasana Rao and I'm a corporate partner with Trilegal. I'm joined by my partner, Kunal Gupta. Kunal, would you like to introduce yourself before we start?
Thank you, Upasana. And thank you, Nupur. Very generous and kind introduction. And we're absolutely delighted and honored to be doing this with WinPE. I'm a partner with Upasana in Trilegal, and I mainly handle white-collar investigations, and Upasana and I jointly work on ESG diligences and advisory as well.
And very quickly, thank you so much to Puncham for joining us. We're really looking forward to your viewpoints.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Upasana.
All right. So we are going to talk about due diligence, and I fully appreciate for many of you, it must be a very common topic, but we are trying to give it a fresh view here, as Nupur said, in the wake of the pandemic, because the meaning of due diligence and risk management really has taken a new, it's taken a new meaning for many of us. Any of you practitioners in the investment side or advisor side would agree with me. So we will be focusing more on those areas, as well as ESG, which is it's not a very talked about aspect of due diligence, but in the past few years we've seen how important it can be, and the focus on that area must be increased. So we'll focus on that as well. So just to kick it off, what is due diligence? Why do we even need due diligence? What is the objective? So, like I said, what is really the objective of due diligence? It's really to get an insight into the company that we are looking to acquire or invest in, and to evaluate that business opportunity. So you want to investigate into all the relevant aspects of the past, the present, and maybe the predictable future, and assess the risks and identify areas for further investigation in order to take an informed decision about that target. So you'd like to analyze the liabilities, whether there are growth prospects, you want to verify the price that is being claimed for that investment. And so due diligence is not just an administrative step in the transaction. It's a very important exercise. And, if everybody here would agree, and, particularly on the investor side, you would agree that it really represents a duty on the part of the investor to conduct a robust diligence in order to build confidence with its own stakeholders. So a due diligence must be done in a professional and streamlined way. Confidential, legal, financial, commercial data and material information is exchanged, right? Now, we will come to the more current topic, but just to build the ground a little. What are the key aspects of diligence in an M&A transaction, or when I say M&A, I mean investment transaction as well. There are 4 or 5 categories under which diligence will fall under. And so, speaking of the legal aspects first, you would like to see a number of things in terms of compliance, structure, etc. So you like to see the share structure, the organizational structure, whether any special rights to existing shareholders, what are the exit rights, what are the inter se governance terms that have been agreed between shareholders. You would like to see a compliance with law, and that would really that head would really cover everything, including labor, from labor to sector specific compliance, whether the reportings have been done, whether the books are in order, whether all conditions that apply to that specific sector for sensitive sectors particularly have they been complied with. We'd like to see if there is good title to properties, there's validity in the licenses, whether they've been kept, they've been renewed, they've been complied with in terms of conditions. You'd like to see if there are material liabilities and litigation in the company. You'd like to see if the company is too leveraged, is there very high debt in the company. You'd also like to see, transaction specific consents that might be required. For instance, if there's a sector specific consent, or it triggers a competition clearance requirement, or there are certain contracts under which there may be conditions for consent if there is, say, any investment or an investment over a certain threshold or a change of control. So these are some of the legal considerations. And then, I'll bring in Kunal, but just before that, want to just highlight why ESG is taking, so much focus these days. I think one of the reasons is that there's really a growing realization that there's an investor fiduciary duty to invest responsibly, and to assess investment returns, not only in terms of financial returns, but also the social, environmental, and organizational impact of the investment. And the second most important reason is that, it's also realized that ESG companies provide at least as good as the usual type of returns, or even better than usual type of returns, because ESG implementation really helps in managing all kinds of risks, whether it's legal in terms of compliance with laws, whether it's reputational in terms of labor working conditions and diversity aspects, whether it's financial risk in terms of having good financial controls in the company. There should not be any poor governance features, there shouldn't be operational mismanagement. And so it's been really found that firms or companies with responsible ESG practices significantly de-risk the business, and therefore they increase the profitability and are able to attract higher valuations in investments. So Kunal, I would invite you to speak a little more on ESG.
Thank you, Upasana. Just to add to what Upasana just articulated, I think ESG is also, if you look at from an investee perspective, companies are looking to, which are in the mode of fundraising, they want to obviously open themselves up to a lot of ESG specific funds, and obviously make themselves eligible for those funds. So I think that's another reason why we see, at least in the vendor diligences or other companies are becoming more and more conscious of ESG, and also making disclosures to that effect. They are looking to enlist themselves in the various ESG indexes. So that's really the reason why. I mean, there is it is not really a legal reason. There are countries that have enacted ESG laws. Those are mainly the European countries, and some of those laws have extraterritorial implications as well. But the real reason why we hear about ESG these days is not really because of a legal reason. It is because there are a lot of, as Upasana mentioned, there are a lot of funds which have an ESG mandate, they have policies, and they really need to comply with those. So that's really the motivation of why you have ESG. And Upasana sort of discussed a little bit on that, but let me elaborate. I think the idea of a diligence is, and ESG diligence, like any other diligence, is typically done in two phases. There is a screening phase which is mainly a desktop-based diligence. It sort of involves looking into databases, looking into various filings that are available on the target entity. And the idea is to understand whether this particular potential candidate would fit into the overall matrix of the fund, which is looking to make an investment, right? So the determining factor could be whether the company has is in the sectors that the fund is interested in doing. For example, they could be sectors such as mining or conflict minerals, where the funds are they cannot invest in those sectors. So to the extent there are investee companies touch points with those aspects, those need to be evaluated. The second aspect is obviously to understand there are inherent sectoral risks. So, when you talk about environmental, so you need to understand whether, there are compliance with environmental laws, energy conservation, effluent treatments, pollution prevention, emissions, and things like that. Are those being taken care of or not? Again, from a social perspective, and it really is a sectoral analysis that you need to do in a diligence. So, there's no one size fit all approach. And from a social perspective, you will want to evaluate on the labor and working conditions, gender equality, all the EHS related compliances, equal opportunity, and then employee and customer relations, community relations, how the land and other assets have been obtained. And then finally comes the governance piece of it. That's a G part of the ESG. And that piece covers the traditional anti-bribery, anti-corruption diligence. Plus, you want to look at from an AML, anti-money laundering standpoint, whether there are issues from a fraud prevention, whether there are policies in place from a fraud prevention, insider dealing, insider trading perspective. Are there a lot of related party transactions happening, or there are, depending upon the funds, LPs, there could be aspects of financing of terrorism aspects also involved. So those are the integrity checks that you would want to carry out. And all this, and we will talk about that in a little bit of detail, when put on a risk horizon, would sort of comprise of the ESG diligence. And that's what generally gets reflected in your documents, and you want to evaluate those aspects, both from a materiality and a legal risk perspective. Puncham, do you want to sort of comment? How do you see it from an investor's perspective?
Absolutely. So, in the last 3 to 5 years, I would say, emphasis on ESG diligence and ESG compliance has multiplied. If you were to look at a multiple of the importance of this would be higher than any returns that private equity firms would have made. Just in the last 5 years, ESG compliance part of it's as important now as financial, legal, commercial diligence was or has been. It's no longer sort of a sidebar diligence. It's no longer a sidebar diligence anymore, and there are huge costs of ESG diligence as we go about. We have seen examples of businesses where, for example, there is a manufacturing facility, right? And there is soil contamination that the manufacturing facility is causing. The State Pollution Control Board has come down and shut the plant down, and that it's remained shut for 6 months. That year becomes a washout for that business. It's massive value erosion. One, not only because there is incremental emphasis from governments and regulatory bodies on ESG compliance. You can't bribe your way through those things for businesses. there is extreme emphasis now from investors to make sure that these costs don't come in, that the funds that they are deployed in businesses that are sensitive to the environment around them, sensitive to people around them. They're socially and environmentally more sort of compliant with things, right? I think that has changed drastically over the last 5 years. So these are huge costs if not checked in and corrected at the right point.
Thanks, Puncham. So, I mean, just one last point on this before we move on to the next slide is that even LPs, DFIs, pension funds, various private equity investors who are signatories to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment have incorporated ESG requirements into their own appraisal process for investment proposals. So that really drives ESG adoption into even venture capital funds and then down to the portfolio companies, which is why more and more focus on this, not just to larger companies, but also to smaller size firms and startups. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So I think here we wanted to just talk about some new considerations that are coming into being in the wake of the pandemic. It really changed various aspects of deal making, not in terms of volume, because volume did pick up later in the year, but in the manner in which deals are being done. And of course, risk management has taken a new meaning, and due diligence is emphasized as a significant aspect of risk management. So the impact of COVID-19 needs to be seen on the target from a legal, compliance, HR, business, insurance, financial, operational perspective. All of these things need to be looked at in the diligence. And of course, in terms of process, things have moved differently. Most information and discussions are now taking place on a virtual platform. So I would say legal diligence had already moved into virtual data rooms. It's not very common to have physical data rooms, except in very specific situations where, for instance, there's very sensitive commercial information which needs to be discussed in a physical setting, particularly for listed companies. But otherwise, legal diligence was quite commonly done through virtual data rooms. But new tools are now being utilized even for investigative and commercial diligence. So, Kunal, would you like to speak about that on the investigative side and how diligence has progressed?
Thank you, Upasana. So, pandemic has changed a lot of things, and I think the use of technology has come to rescue. I'll take example of ESG and perhaps more on the governance piece as to how technology is being used to conduct diligence when no site visit were really possible and deals had to happen. So, just take a step back. There are typically two levels, especially both on ESG and on, including on the anti-bribery governance piece. One is a screening level, which is when you are evaluating a particular entity and a particular target, a bunch of targets, whether those are worth pursuing further or not, right? You want to understand what are the risks which are basically on a discrete basis, in a discrete manner. These are mainly desktop based. You use a lot of detailed databases, litigation databases, searches, penetrative databases. That piece did not get affected. That was the same way it was being conducted earlier. That sort of continued on. I think it acquired a lot more importance because now the investors were placing a lot of reliance on this, which was earlier perhaps not relied upon as much. I mean, even though there were risks that were being presented in screening time, investors were still willing to go ahead and take a look at it and see whether, when they actually got the term sheet signed, whether they were actually, those risks bore out or not. So that piece continued as it is. I think there was another element of screening which we used to call as a boots on ground approach, right? When you want to evaluate, again, in a discrete manner, whether, for example, is the company actually having, let's say an ENS policy? Does the company generally have a reputation of making payments to obtain its permits, right? Does the company provide for basic facilities of, to its contractual staff? Those questions you wanted to understand to get a very basic minimum threshold awareness of a target. That is the piece that got impacted. And I think the way we saw it, we again used technology to come up to, we had to use sometimes very localized resources who were at least, who didn't have to traverse states, but were localized and were able to get the information. Second, we had to rely a lot more on the media and public information that was available. So Puncham alluded to Pollution Control Board. We had to do a lot of searching through pollution control boards to see whether companies have made filings, and what those filings contain. So there are regular filings that are contained, whether the company has had issues in any of its plants in the past with the local environmental approvals, whether they were given any sort of warning by the local environment authorities in the past. So that, sort of the piece where we were using a lot more penetrative databases that sort of supplemented what was a traditional boots on ground approach. And that was the screening part. I think on the main diligence, what we found that the discussions went on. Obviously, the discussions were not happening as much on the, in person, but were sort of the Zoom calls or, on a remote basis. What we did was we used innovative ways to test out things. So back in the day when we would go down to perform site visits, and there's no better way than checking the compliance by sort of, you have to walk the talk. And we were performing site visits to, for example, identify if a particular housing facility for nursing mothers, which are in the contractual labor, has been provided or not, or have you provided for your contractual female workers separate washrooms. So what we did was we put an onus upon the company to provide pictures, and secondly, looked at the expenses that they had incurred in their books to create those facilities. So we kind of used the books and records analysis to come to a proxy to whether those facilities existed or not. And in that manner, sort of to the extent, most of the companies had those records in their ERP systems. We were able to actually, cross that hurdle and move along. So, there were parts that were impacted and there were parts that were not impacted. And the parts that were impacted, we had to use proxies, as a given example of looking at books and records and other self sort of disclosures, or detailed diligences through Pollution Control Board and regulatory authorities to actually come to sort of the similar determination as we would in a normal pre-pandemic time. Puncham, your views, your experiences during pandemic time, how has that changed?
And especially how commercial diligence and technical diligence, commercial diligence, how you would have evaluated the business case. We know that Everstone's been quite active on deals.
Yeah, absolutely. So the big part, I'll take it diligence by diligence, right? So to cut it into financial, commercial, legal, right? And just covering the financial part quickly, briefly touched upon it. That's from a seamlessness of diligence. It's reasonably straightforward, even remotely. Given that financial data is can be transmitted electronically, you can do most of your cuts and analysis offline, online rather, and have a view. But what you need to make sure you're doing correct is the entire COVID impact analysis on the financial, right? Because some businesses have actually gained a lot from the pandemic, especially on the healthcare side. Some businesses have suffered a lot due to the pandemic. So we have to make sure we adjust accurately for some of those things. So that's on the financial DD side. On the commercial diligence side, it depends on the kind of business you're buying. So let me take it by examples, right? If you're looking at a brick and mortar manufacturing business, like in the mining sector, right? There the impact, you actually need to be at the site to be able to assess things, the practices, the governance, the environment, regulation compliances, the entire ESG diligence. It's going to be impossible to diligence such an environment sensitive business remotely, right? You would not be able to sort of take accurate calls doing that kind of a diligence. And there are agencies even today that are sort of going to sites, visiting sites in sort of reasonable precautions and with safeguards. They're flying around and doing those diligences. We had done a few of those diligences with respect to plants. We also sold businesses where people actually made videos of the sites and of every alley, every machine, every nook and corner of the site was videographed and sent outside the country for people to be able to do a site visit. Then there are direct to consumer internet businesses where there are no such site visits. You want to meet the management, which you comfortably do online. It is important to know the person you're investing in personally. Often, and that's been a constraint, especially at the peak of the pandemic waves. The other businesses like healthcare, hospitals, people need to do site visits, right, to assess several compliances, to see the spec of the asset, to see the facility is fire compliant, but facilities have COVID patients. Most facilities have COVID patients. So you've seen some sort of slowdown in transactions, private equity and diligence-led transactions on that side of things. So and as you get windows between pandemic, right, to assess that, you've been able to do a better job of diligence there. Environment, the same thing as commercial. Same all the same criteria apply there as well. On the legal side, again, it is reasonably sort of doable online. There are documents that need to be sort of transmitted. But having said that, how well a company is able to facilitate a digital diligence is also a testimony to their readiness from a governance standpoint, from a readiness from how robust their systems and processes are, right? Because eventually all data should be digital at some point in time, depending on the size and scale of the business you're investing in. You can sense a readiness and future-proof, how future-proof the business is with that kind of a diligence.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think just one other aspect on the impact of or COVID on target companies, and one aspect that we look into particularly on the legal side, and for many businesses this had been an issue for many months, which is the issue of contract performance. So whether it is an FMCG business or it's a real estate business, or across all businesses, there were there were issues around whether there are covenants or obligations which are likely to be breached by the target itself or by its counterparties under contract. So whether the company is likely to take any protection under force majeure defenses under the contract to avoid contractual performance, or has it taken the proper steps to ensure the success of such a defense, right? For instance, did it issue a notice to the counterparty at the right time? Did it take steps to mitigate the loss? Did it apply for insurance? Did it apply for government relief when it had the opportunity to do that? So there are various aspects under contractual performance which had become quite relevant, and I would say that since then things have normalized to an extent, but the effects of that would have been could have shown into the balance sheets as well. Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide. Kunal, did you want to speak a little on the earlier slide about the specific impact, and how COVID really amplified the relevance of ESG in itself?
Sure, absolutely. I think commercially, as COVID was having an impact on a lot of sectors specifically. What we have realized is, and I think generally the clients have become much more sensitive to funds, and investors have become much more sensitive to the ESG parts, right? I mean, a lot of these policies that we had, that we were evaluating especially from a social perspective, and that included sort of the employee welfare and other governance policies. Those come to those are actually tested. A lot of them were tested during the pandemic. So, for example, whether you had you provided for facilities to individuals to work from home. That was classic aspect which sort of bore out. If there were individuals who needed medical leave over and above, employees who needed medical leaves over and above what their entitlement was, as the company made provisions to those effect from an employee welfare perspective, those were actually aspects that were tested out during the COVID time. So, I think a lot of things, a lot of policies, a lot of SOPs that we would evaluate, and I think pre-pandemic that were kind of regarded by some of the investors that checked the box, and they were sort of looked at as just policies being put in place, never to be ever tested. Those were actually tested out, and how, and that I think has sort of put more realism into the ESG diligence. So a lot of these, how a lot of these factors, their bearing or their weightage in materiality has significantly increased, and I think that will have an impact on how we evaluate from a risk perspective as well, which I think is going to be the next topic that we cover.
Exactly. So, once we make this laundry list of our findings and identify the various risks, the next step is really to evaluate the implications and address this in the transaction. So this requires decisions to be made on whether the transaction is feasible, whether the investor wants to proceed with the transaction at all, whether there is good synergy in the transaction, is there a business case, whether changes are required to the terms of the transaction to go ahead, whether the risk can be quantified and adjusted for, whether the value is affected at all, and whether all of these risks that have been identified, are they capable of being addressed within the envisaged transaction timeline, right? So, making a risk matrix is always a useful tool. And so it's better to sort of categorize these risks thoughtfully into a couple of buckets. So, of course, if you look on the right side of this matrix, there are those factors, those risks which will challenge the transaction in itself. So it may lead to parties abandoning the transaction because there might be some deal breaker issues. So deal breaker issues would be risks that are so deeply threaten the feasibility of the transaction or the value that it's a threat to execution itself. So they are essentially non-starters, right? And typically they could be external factors or internal. In fact, to take an example, if there are major uncertainties in the business as a result of sudden COVID impact, it could very well be a deal breaker. If there's a major risk of insolvency, right, which you don't think can be addressed, then that could be a deal breaker. If there are major glaring issues with cultural incompatibility between the parties, right? That itself could be a reason to abandon the project. And things like malpractice or integrity issues, corporate integrity issues. So these are major ESG related risks. So ESG related risks can definitely be deal breakers for many investors. Kunal, any thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, we can talk about some examples, and maybe that will help the audience to contextualize some of these deal breakers. Like, if a company is heavily into government procurement, right? It is sort of institutional business supported, and you have discovered that there is a CBI on an enforcement directorate proceeding that is going on with a fairly significant risk. That is going to have a very significant impact, and that may just be a deal breaker for the investor, right? Then, if a company, for example, is in a business that you realize that it is heavily reliant on a particular item. Let's say it's a steel plant, and it is reliant on mining licenses that are sort of tethered to the plant. And those mining licenses have been challenged, and let's say the courts or the Pollution Control Board have taken at the highest level, at the NGT level or at the Supreme Court level, have taken a call that these are obtained wrongly, and they're going to have impact. That is going to have a fundamental impact on the value that you bring in from that, and those could be deal breakers as well. So from an ESG and a sort of integrity perspective, there could be several instances where it may just be better to walk away, cut your losses and walk away. And those are the classic aspects of deal breakers.
Yes. For many investors, integrity issues can be a zero tolerance zone. So, which is why, if the ESG diligence uncovers some major wrongdoings, these are probably not likely to be addressed through any documentation, and many investors would rather not execute a transaction if there are such major concerns, right? And then there could be non-ESG aspects which could be deal breakers. For example, change of government policy which doesn't allow, say, a certain type of investor to invest, or a certain investor from a certain jurisdiction to invest. That itself could really deter the transaction, right? Now, the other type of example is where it's not a deal breaker as such, but it's definitely a red flag, where there are serious concerns that have been identified through the diligence. Now, there may be concerns, or there could even be regulatory approvals that are required. And maybe if the regulatory consent is discretionary in nature, right? So if the consent is not obtained, then you would have to abandon the project. So that type of an issue needs to be, given a different kind of consideration, a more serious type of consideration. Threats of major litigations, or threats of, major loss of business, for instance, some contracts that the company is majorly dependent on, or suppliers that it's majorly dependent on. If those contracts have terminated and there's a serious risk of loss of business, or there are similar material adverse events, right? Those could be red flags. Now, red flags could be addressed in the documents. There could be a timeline given to the company to kind of address that risk, maybe settle a dispute, or renew a contract, or go obtain that regulatory approval. So if those issues are addressed, then the transaction can go ahead. If not, there is no ability to proceed. So those are serious red flag issues. Then there are other issues where it may not be a red flag as such, but there are issues which, from the point of executing the transaction, they are not important, but they are definitely important from the point of view of valuation. So they are a threat to realizing the intended value in the deal, right? And so they could affect financial performance in the foreseeable future, or So similar high priority items where there could be some risks which are identified in the diligence, and there could be, now how you would address it in the transaction could be various ways. So it may not be something that you necessarily have to do as a condition to the funding. It could be a covenant, it could be a post-closing obligation, it could be something that you after the transaction can assist in resolving through your integration plans. So there could be those type of issues as well. And then there are some issues which are routine issues there. So, every company across the globe, it's not particularly just in India, but in any company, there could be certain, low impact sort of concerns, which are routine concerns, and they arise in the ordinary course of business. Now, there is no need for the diligence to particularly, or the documentation to particularly address it, but it is something to stop and take note of. And maybe, in your integration plans or in the post-closing obligations or as a good governance practice, those things can be built in and planned for. So some of these low impact items could even include ESG policies, for example, because while, like Kunal already mentioned, they may not be legal requirements, so they are not necessarily a non-compliance, but they are requirements that are necessary for an investor to see on an ongoing business, in an ongoing way in a portfolio company. So it may be that they require certain policies to be amended in a certain way or integrated with their global policies, right? There might be, so we will talk about post-deal integration strategies as well a little later in the discussion. But any thoughts from Puncham on this? How do you usually categorize the risks? And
so in general, the investor perspective with respect to businesses that you stumble upon unscrupulous dealings, you stumble upon enforcement directorate kind of things that Kunal was mentioning. Sarbanes-Oxley exists for a lot of funds, right? And a lot of the funds are SEC registered, US SEC registered. Investing in these kind of businesses could have fund level implications, right? Where you could have SEC inquiries, especially FDI funds, right? Most funds, in my view, would not even, there is no addressing such things. You can't address culture, right? You have to sort of know who you're backing as a business, who you're backing as founders. And once you do that, you need to make sure that if there is a filing non-compliance, tax refund non-refund issue, you can understand some of these things. No businesses are 100% compliant for at most times, right? But if there is a practice and a culture issue, you would probably know when to back out, right? Because such things will play out again, even if you correct something. And no amount of documentation and indemnities can sort of protect you against a practice like that. And you're not running the business as an investor. You will not have any control about what management does. So you need to take a call. These are binary calls that you need to make at that point in time.
Right, absolutely. So, if there are issues that can be addressed through documentation, then how would we do that? I think, some of the common ways of doing that are actually, I already mentioned some of it. So you can have conditions to the funding. You can have a list of conditions precedent. You can have representations and warranties. Those are heavily negotiated in these investment documents because you want to rely on these representations being made by the company and the shareholders behind it, the main shareholders behind it. Right. So the representations and warranties could be fundamental in nature, which affect, the core of the business or the title to shares, and even a lot of anti-bribery issues sometimes find their way into the fundamental list of warranties. For many investors, those are very, very crucial aspects. So these are highly negotiated as to what would be fundamental warranties. And then there are business operational warranties. Those are on, those are to give comfort on more compliance with law issues, that there are no litigations, there are no threat of contract termination, etc. With respect to labor compliance, with respect to insurance for the business, being in place and being according to market practice, best practices being followed. So there are a host of these operational warranties which are also part of the document. And of course, the breach of these warranties, now representations and warranties are typically given as of the date of execution of the agreement. And then if there is a gap between the signing of the agreement and the funding of the investment, so the closing of the transaction, then usually you also bring down the warranties by having the company and the promoters or the founders repeat those warranties at the time of the investment itself, right? So, and if there are tranches, then again, you would bring down the representation and warranties each time there is an investment. So a breach of these warranties will then lead to indemnity rights. There are indemnity rights which are also negotiated heavily in the transaction. And when I say negotiation, it extends from the cap on the indemnity, what would be the maximum amount that you can recover for a breach of representation and warranties. What maybe there could be a de minimis, meaning that some smaller claims have to just be forgotten. So your claim amount should be at least of a certain threshold beyond which you can make an indemnity claim, and the contractual agreement between both sides would be that anything below that would not amount to an indemnity claim, right? So these are common ways of addressing this in the investment documentation. And other than that, or related to that, in fact, is this new product which is very commonly being used these days, which is warranty and indemnity insurance. So warranty and indemnity insurance is essentially a way of it's an alternate to these negotiated indemnity clauses where you get indemnity only from the shareholders. So here you basically get an insurance, an insurer to release the indemnity amount to you if there is a breach of a representation and warranty provided in the contract, right? And these are, it's an emerging trend in a lot of M&A transactions. I would say that for smaller sized investments where it's not a control stake, it's not very commonly used, but where there's a control stake deal, even with a private equity investor, we have started to see a lot of this, W&I insurance being used in the Indian market as well, right? So of course, one of the features of this insurance is that there are some standard exclusions. So anything which is known to the investor, issues that are already known are excluded from the scope of the insurance. So whatever has been uncovered under the due diligence report, for instance, or the disclosure materials, if there are disclosure schedules in the agreement, those would be excluded from the scope of the insurance, and other fair disclosures would be excluded. And other standard exclusions include even environmental aspects. So environmental pollution, asbestos, anti-bribery and corruption. These are the typical exclusion items in the W&I insurance. But if there are specific concerns that an investor has about certain limits or exclusions, for example, intellectual property infringement, for instance, or even environmental insurance, environmental risks, you could have a separate policy for that, and which is basically an excess coverage rider to that policy, and there will be additional premiums. So that option is available. And then there are also, liability insurance, which is also available. So this differs from warranty and indemnity coverage, which is, for covering unknown exposures, whereas liability insurance is, it's designed to cover a known risk, but which is uncertain. For instance, a tax liability or a litigation liability where that there is a tax dispute or a litigation which is ongoing, but you don't know you believe that there are, there is a good chance of a successful resolution or the dispute being resolved finally in the favor of the company, but there is still a risk that there might not be a successful litigation. So in that context, a liability insurance can provide the investor an indemnity for financial loss which arises from a challenge from a tax authority on that tax dispute. And so it removes certain uncertain potential tax liabilities or litigation liabilities. And some other areas it can cover also are environmental exposures, for example, IP infringement claims, employment matters and litigation disputes, as I talked about, and difference in accounting methods. These are some of the areas that liability insurance can also cover. So just one last point on insurance. Now, in light of the COVID pandemic, most underwriters, in fact, want an exclusion for the direct negative effects of COVID-19. So any new risk that is a direct implication of COVID-19, right, would generally be excluded. So, but there is scope for negotiation on that, and that exclusion can be removed or at least limited during underwriting if the insurer is provided more comfort through diligence, or if they're given a better understanding of the actual impact of COVID-19 on that target, on the target's business or operations. Any thoughts, Kunal? Would you like to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly. I'm aware of the time, so just very quickly, a couple of points. I think on the governance aspect, especially because there are sometimes deal breakers, and we hear this query very often. What is going to be if I've discovered something? Am I going to be looking at a criminal liability inheriting to me? So generally, as a rule of thumb, you're not going to inherit a criminal liability unless you continue with those same practices after post investment, right? So the liabilities are to the specific acts of the individuals, and those are not not necessarily the criminal liabilities don't attach to the asset per se. So even if you are going to buy it out, that does not mean that you're going to inherit the criminal liabilities. Obviously, if you carry on with the same practices, then more likely than not you're going to do that. I think the second aspect is from while that is an issue, but and Puncham was alluding to this, a lot of the funds and the strategic M&A that may be happening are those are SEC registrants. So those would be covered by FCPA and a variety of other extraterritorial legislation. So UK Bribery Act, and there could be also the sort of sapping tool in French companies. While there may be a sort of a higher threshold from a criminal perspective, those legislations really the companies are increasingly, or the funds are increasingly putting the integrity issues in a sort of the lower right quadrant of a risk evaluation, which is the deal breakers. And really the reason is that there are massive fines that you would incur as a result of that. Again, from an E and S perspective, there are issues, and I think those are typically from an ESG perspective. One aspect that an ESG report should always have is a standard report will always have sort of the procedures performed, the findings, and then sort of the gap analysis and the plan to remedy that, right? And I think the real discussion on ESG is what is a fair expectation from an investee to achieve within a sort of a limited time frame before the closure of the deal. So that is something which may not necessarily fall in the sort of a necessarily deal breakers, but you are not. I think the investors also very cognizant of the fact that they don't want to make a Fortune 500 company overnight, or in terms of processes and controls of a sort of classic promoter-led Indian company. But at the same time, they want to have them some very clear path of high risk and medium risk areas that have been identified in the E and S diligence, and lay down a clear commitment to put in place those policies and practices in place. So generally, what we have seen is that there is a remediation plan that is put in place, and generally the companies are sort of more agreeable to sort of putting those and before the transaction materializes. Upasana?
Yeah. And then, on post-deal integration, I think there again, a strategy is needed. And in our experience, investors often want to start on strategizing this right from the beginning of the deal. So it's not something that you do after the deal closed, because you want to ensure you're taking steps to maximize the synergies in the deal, and really align your goals and realize the value that you intended to. When we talk about integration, there are various areas that you could focus on, and this could include from technology and systems. For instance, do you need a different strategy for combining technology or changing technology systems, whether it's internal policies or compliance policies, including your employee related policies, your anti-bribery related policy. Is it robust enough? Do you need a new code of conduct? Do you need a competition or fair dealing best practices policy? Do you need any policy change when it even comes to cultural issues, for instance, working hours, working from home? So these are also part of in a way ESG. So all these things, we've heard this from investors quite a bit, that they have this M&A integration 100-day plan. So essentially it's like a playbook that they start on, but the discussion starts right from the beginning of a transaction and not really after, because you want to plan well in advance for it. So maybe I would request Pancham to speak a little about how important is this post-deal integration and the planning for it.
Thanks, Upasana. I'll speak on audio. My connection seems to be already. Sure. But most of us, the way we are, once our diligence is done, you will, and you find holes in the diligence. Whatever is fixable, you would try to fix that through a remediation plan. As you mentioned, it's called corrective action plan, or CAPA. All right, and it could be to do with at the manufacturing plant level. It could be with the capital expenditure that you need to incur, whether it's a hospital fire compliances, labor law compliances. You could have local farm law compliances, horticulture compliances. There are, like, the number of regulations are not few here, right? So you generally draw out a point by point corrective action plan. You assign timelines. Some of them are conditions precedent, where you don't part with your funds till they are completed. Some of them can become conditions subsequent with timelines attached. The conditions subsequent, if not fulfilled, are obviously material breaches, often, right, to your shareholders agreement. So the companies are pressed hard, with founders being responsible, the CXOs being responsible for making sure that these conditions subsequent, or the corrective action plan, or the remediation plan is completed. And very often we've seen, right, we've taken 10 to 15% of our total capex budgets for the businesses have gone into corrective action plans. So we've seen transactions where up to 200 million rupees, 300 million rupees have been spent just to be environment compliant, or environment regulation compliant, fire compliant, labor law compliant. That's the sort of spend we've seen, and that's not small. That's not a small sum by Indian standards. So, and very often we have one person dedicated at the fund level, just monitoring and measuring the completion of the remediation plan, and two, continuous compliance with the laws and the remediation plan. So both these things are sort of done at the fund level, and in fact we have specific people just designated to do to look into that, not only from a legal side of things, but even from from the perspective of having a full-time ESG officer within the fund.
Thanks, Puncham. So I'm aware we've kind of exceeded our 1 hour, but we could quickly go through those case scenarios. The idea is not to dissect it too much, but just to give it to speak about it as an illustration to all the points that we just discussed in this session. Okay, so I don't think we need it necessarily on the screen, because I believe we had shared it in advance with everybody here. Right, so I'll just start off with a few points, and then Kunal, you could take over. So we sent over two very hypothetical case studies. They have no resemblance to any real life in circumstance or case that we know of, but this is just to illustrate the type of issues that we were talking about. Now, in the first scenario, you'll see that this is a sort of a number one, it's a capital intensive business. There are dependencies on the supply side. There are defaults to the customers under their contracts due to COVID, and then there are red flags when you look at government dealings that are involved in this business. For instance, when it comes to the mining license, the kind of business is very high on government interface, as well as the land that has been acquired under a lease from the government. So there are it's replete with questions on the ESG side, whether there were rehabilitation issues, whether there was proper compensation to land users, whether there are other environmental issues at the site, and then there are obviously it's a highly leveraged company. So are there rights? What are the rights of the lenders? Is there a risk of default? Is there any past litigation issue? Is there so companies of this type you would usually see a lot of related party transactions as well, service agreements between related parties, or loans from group companies or loans to group companies. So you would like to look into those things, right? So these are the kind of issues that you would see in a company of this sort. And we already spoke about how we would go about it, but I mean we don't have the time to really dissect how the whole process would run, but these are generally the areas, and this is a classic example where all of these issues would typically be looked into. Kunal, to add?
Yeah, just to chime in very quickly, I think on the I would really sort of from an ESG perspective, at least, I would really focus on the governance piece here. Sort of their expenses, just given the fact that there is so much of a government interface which is core to the company's business model, one would want to scrutinize very, very carefully, right? Again, then what kind of business practices, what kind of sustainable mining practices are being followed or not. That's more on the environment side. On the land, Upasana, you alluded to, from an ESG, just from an ESG perspective, one would want to really understand how, while the land is being leased by the government to the company, how was that land originally procured from the farmers? Was it a panchayat land? Was it a land that was sort of agricultural land that was, which act was the land acquired under which pretext? We have seen a lot of cases coming as a result of it, whether there are claims that are pending in the courts from the original title holders. So those are the kind of things, again, from the mining practices perspective, you would want to probably see what is the impact that they have on dynamiting in the mining sites, on the neighborhood, residential and commercial areas. What is the post-mining sort of activities that are being performed here, and looking at the filings from a pollution control perspective. So overall, almost all the three elements are sort of right, and they deserve to be sort of evaluated in this case.
Yeah, and this list of issues sort of also illustrates those categorizations that we earlier talked about. Because if on the government dealing side, for instance, there is a red flag, then very possibly that could be a deal breaker for any investment here. All right, and then if we look at the other scenario that we had sent to you, that is a situation where there is a much smaller startup company going through a transition because of the pandemic, having to kind of pivot its business into something which is a little more regulated, because now they moved on to a technology platform, so they need to look into. So if you're planning an investment, you would have to look into aspects of data security, technology integrity. They also have there's a environmental aspect here which we flagged. There's excessive use of plastic boxes, for instance. That's an environmental aspect. There are employee related issues, because firstly, there are gig workers involved here. There are employees who are working from home. So is employee welfare and employee protection being considered well enough according to ESG expectations? And then again, if you look at the governance structure, that's not very ideal either. There is a 5-member team, but it's essentially there's not enough diversity. There's not enough comfort with the management structure which has been built in. So it may be a small issue, but there are a number of things which could concern an investor, both from a legal, from a commercial, as well as ESG perspective.
And just to quickly chime in on that, Upasana, I think one practical experience that we have had is that a lot of times, the startups are not really, and this is a reality, they are not really following, they're not having standard operating procedures, they're not having policies, and not every time that they're going out and seeking or making a large purchase, there are 3-4 process being followed, etc. Well, one understand the business efficiency and sort of the swiftness part of it, but the reality is that later on in their evolution, when they sort of come to a certain critical level, those become very, very critical, because as they're growing, sort of managing the size and the vulnerabilities from the the governance perspective become much more critical. So I think what we have seen is that when the investors are looking to do this diligence, they are having this very straight talk and heart-to-heart talk with the founders to say that, look, this is some of the things you need to you probably have not looked at earlier, but you now need to do if you really want to scale up, and this is kind of a necessary cost that you would have to incur. So having someone sort of to look at the compliance, welfare of your workers or gig workers, because this has a massive reputational impact on your on your business model, and can really make or break your business model, in addition to obviously from the compliance standpoint. So I think we have seen this discussion which earlier would happen much later on, right, in the sort of evolution of the funding of the startups, and Series F or G are going on. But now they're having those right at the beginning when sort of the seed money or Series A money is being provided as well.
Puncham, would you like to give an investor's perspective here? So, startups don't always have the resources to put all these things in place, but from an investor's perspective, is the approach towards startups different from other companies?
Look, the way I'll put it is there are different funds for different kind of investments, right? There are venture capital funds, there are private equity funds. From a private equity fund, and these sort of requirements for any investee company are more fund driven rather than the kind of company it is, right? These are fund mandates, whether it's a startup or a large business. All of them would have similar compliances from an investor perspective. That does not change, right? But from a startup perspective, I think what is the ingoing, ingoing compliances may be fewer because a lot of startups are tech enabled, right? And there are more ESG kind of compliances on the brick and mortar side of things today as we stand. But there are structure related compliances that they need to be that need to be met, right? So, FDI rules, you've already seen a lot of regulation come in on the e-commerce side and massive fines being imposed on some of the largest horizontals on the e-commerce side. So you need to be making sure that you're compliant with fund flow regulations from a government standpoint. But the other thing is the startup regulation landscape is continuously evolving. It's not sort of stationary, right? There are new regulations all the time, and that may require structure changes, entity level changes on an ongoing basis. So one needs to be monitoring that, and you're sort of in structure diligence continuously as some of these regulations evolve. Our tech regulation landscape is also regulation landscape is also evolving every day, right? So you need to be on top of that even post transaction. That's all I'll say.
Right, absolutely agree. So I think we've covered all the theory part of and the case analysis that we had. If there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them on.
Upasana, Kunal, Puncham, thank you so much. I think we had a fantastic and a very comprehensive session today, covering a lot of details and a lot of ground. And I really appreciate all of you making time over this holiday weekend. And I must say, we've received a number of email requests for a recording of the session. And I think it is probably because it is one of those weekends when people do have family and personal commitments. So very similar to session 1, we will be making this recording available. And again, a big thank you to Upasana, Kunal, Puncham for sharing your insights, your experience, for sharing your time with us on a weekend, and for letting us put up this recording for everybody to view in future again. So thank you once again.